Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. Welcome to our first lecture for Module 1, and it's called What is Emergency Management? I'm going to talk you through today some very broad definitions of emergency management, and then we're going to talk about some other stuff online that will help you think through what emergency management is, all that sort of thing. Before we talk next module about how emergency management came about, I guess. There is a cricket game going on behind me down in the, wherever that is. I apologise if you can hear that ticking away in the background. So, emergency management is a very complex area. And I have to say, since starting in this field, I do have many moments where I'm feeling like Fry on this particular slide. Not sure if I have a headache or if my brain is melting, because there are so many different areas involved in this process, in the process of emergency management, in the governance of emergency management, in the doing of emergency management. It's very different to policing, for example. So policing is just one thing. It's one part of, very, very small part of emergency management. And in some instances, police won't particularly be involved in any way, shape or form. The decision making that comes in an emergency will happen much higher. So it's just hugely complex, and it's often very hard to navigate your thoughts across all of these different elements that are coming together. I've got a picture here. I know it seems quite random, but a lot of people think about the first emergency manager as being Noah. Not that fond of religion, but it provides a really good example here, because people talk about Noah as being the first emergency manager, where he built this incredible boat to take on a whole bunch of different animals and all of that sort of stuff, so that they would survive this devastating event that happened a long, long time ago. And there is a guy overseas, I can't remember where he's from now. Nope, it's totally gone under my head. Well done, brain. Where he's actually built a full life-size replica of Noah's Ark. If you Google it, you can find more information about him and his pretty fabulous boat. So that's the picture that I've included in this slide. But yes, it's very complex and it's very hard to track, and it's called lots of different things, and yeah, it's a world of fun to try and get your head around. But let's start at the basics. What is an emergency? Emergency could be so many different things to so many different people, and it can actually have different meanings depending on the people involved as well. So the word emergency is used in relation to multiple events. Sorry, folks, you can see I usually print out my slides. So as I'm going through and I'm talking to you, I can see them on here, because the words on this screen that I'm looking at here look like little ants. Emergency is used in relation to multiple events or situations across different domains of life and across different functional sectors. It is a quality of unpredictable rapid change and the time of a turning point. This is particularly important. Typically, an emergency or situation is named as an emergency if urgent, time-limited action is deemed necessary to forestall, stop, or otherwise affect some kind of undesired future. Really fantastic definition of emergency provided by Anderson in 2016. There's another one that he talks about. Actually, no, he goes on to talk about this a little bit later in this whole section. This entire article written by Anderson is dedicated to a discussion of what emergency means. So it's really, really detailed. You don't need to know huge amounts of that. He says it's a sense that something valued, life, health, security, a sense that something valued is at risk, and importantly, a sense that there is a limited time with which to curtail irreparable harm or damage to whatever it is that has been valued. So, of course, we can see any number of different situations where these types of things are occurring. There's one demonstrated in this picture here, which of course appears to be flooding. There's, tsunamis, tornadoes, earthquakes, any number of different types of natural disasters that happen in that respect. But they're, of course, human disasters as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the World Health Organization talks about a disaster as any occurrence that causes damage, ecological disruption, loss of human life, or deterioration of health services on a scale sufficient to warrant an extraordinary response from outside the affected community or area. So a really great example of this might be bird flu. Bird flu was something which impacted people across a whole range of different contexts. Another one would be mad cow disease. Another one might be a nuclear meltdown. So that's the way the World Health Organization thinks about a disaster. A hazard is a little bit different. It's not a disaster, and it's really important to distinguish between those two things because we talk about emergency management not only in relation to disasters and other types of emergencies, but also in relation to large-scale, massive crises and, of course, hazards. So we might think of an earthquake as a disaster. Yes, it is certainly a disaster, but if you prepare for an emergency like that or a disaster appropriately, it's actually just a hazard. It's something that we need to work around. So tornadoes, for example, are very common in some parts of America, and it's genuinely a hazard that we need to work around. There are different ways that we can do things so that that hazard doesn't have a huge impact on human life. So a hazard can be defined as any phenomenon that has a potential to cause disruption or damage to people and their environment. A hazard is not as severe and alarming as a disaster. Disasters can be man-made, human-made, I would prefer, or natural. So a natural disaster, earthquakes, folds, which is where literally the earth caves in, or ice carving and things like that, where entire countries sized areas of ice just literally carve away into the ocean because of global warming. Droughts, cyclones, tidal waves, snowstorms, and that can be anywhere, but of course in northern mountain regions, Himalayas, stuff like that, etc. Man-made or human-made disasters are atomic bombs, such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, terrorist blasts in New York, so on and so forth, and of course bioterrorism. So we've seen a few instances of sarin gas, which have been used overseas, very small enclosed areas, but has the potential to create large wide-scale panic amongst the local community for obvious reasons, because it's deadly and it kills a lot of people and it spreads rapidly. So now that we've defined emergency and we've defined this disaster and we kind of know what a hazard is as well, what's emergency management? This is actually quite difficult to define, so I'm going to take a few slides to do this. Often when we think of emergencies, we think of, these guys. So police, fire, ambulance, SES, all of those types of emergency organisations. Apologies, folks. And of course, we think of things this way. We think of things like OOO and so forth in the case of an emergency. But emergency management is actually much bigger. It does involve these organisations, but only to a certain extent. Emergency management is about planning for, planning for and exercising, so actually doing and practicing responses to large-scale emergencies and disasters. Emergency management is about the agreements, structures, and policies that are arranged across agencies to deliver an emergency management response and recovery. So we might get the sense that there's images like these ones, where there's a whole bunch of people sitting around a table. The head of those agencies are working together according to structures and policies that they've put in place previously in order to manage that emergency. Okay, it's a pretty critical thing to have in place. So as you can see, we can see, this way, we can see police and SES sitting at the table in that particular slide, but they are only part of that response. They're not the whole response in and of itself. There's also organisations like Red Cross, St Vinny's, Volunteering Tasmania, a whole bunch of other different types of organisations can be involved in these emergency responses. So emergency management is also a process, and it's a very, very long, drawn-out process that happens over a huge amount of time and that different stakeholders are involved in depending on what's going on. So it's generally a process of developing and implementing policies and actions, as I was just talking about before, that involve 4 things. Some people talk about it as 5 things, so I'll get to that in a tick. But generally 4 things. It involves mitigation, a course of action to detect the risk to society or the health of people and to reduce that risk. Pretty basic. It involves preparedness, a response plan of action to reduce loss of life and to increase the chance of successful response to the disaster or catastrophe. And of course, that is massive in and of itself. So many different agencies could be involved in that. Even local PCYCs could be involved in preparedness for disasters like this in the ways that they teach young people to think about those types of emergencies. Number 3, response. Provision of emergency aid and assistance in the circumstance where a disaster or a hazard comes into play. And of course, number 4 is recovery. Provision of immediate support to turn life back to this state of normalcy. Recovery is massive, so the response might be quite timely. It might happen within a certain time frame, and it happens immediately, obviously. And depending on what that circumstance is, will depend on how long the response goes for. So when the floods happened in Brisbane, I think it was in 2011. Don't quote me on that. When those floods happened, they were catastrophic. No one expected them to be at the level that they were. The 1974 floods, I think, were a little bit higher and more catastrophic overall, but these floods were really, really substantially catastrophic because not a lot of people were prepared. They were completely and utterly unprepared for this outcome. The response was rapid, but perhaps not as well organised as they were hoping. And the biggest response, which everyone was quite overwhelmed about, was the community. As soon as the floodwaters receded and everyone was in safe ground and all of that sort of stuff, thousands and thousands of volunteers moved in to try and help people with their homes, get rid of the mud, wash everything down, try and get them back into their houses, so on and so forth. So that was pretty massive. And no one, because I used to live in Queensland, no one really understood or expected that level of community response. It was quite amazing. And of course, recovery happened much later than that. So the response we saw, of course, police, probably, I think fire was involved, even though there was probably no fires. Ambulance, state emergency services, all of these people were involved in that response. But that was a very time-limited response. They were involved in a very short amount of time where they were responding to those critical incidents. Recovery happens much further than that. Of course, the recovery process starts at the same time as the response happens, but recovery goes over many, many years. In fact, people are still being counselled today as part of the recovery efforts, right up until 12 months, even 18 months after the floods. I used to walk down George Street towards my uni where I worked, And I would go in there very early in the morning, oftentimes about 7:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, and I'd see this line of counsellors who all had their sort of high-vis vests on. They were waiting to get on the bus to go out into the flood-affected areas, and they would go, door knocking to speak to families and make sure they were getting the support that they needed. It was amazing. So those recovery efforts can happen over a very, very long period of time. So these are the main different areas, and they are freaking colossal. They're massive, massive areas to consider. I could write a whole unit dedicated to each of those 4 areas. As I said before, some people talk about them as 5 different areas. So this one talks about the 4, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. The one that you can see on this slide is prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. So there's actually 5 phases that this particular model covers. So I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, I think it might be Schlegelmilch. I'm sorry, I'm totally hopeless with this stuff. And Albanese. These guys have actually talked about who emergency managers are, who actually does this stuff, this emergency management stuff. Individuals responsible for emergency management include organisation-based emergency managers, employees of public agencies tasked with coordinating emergency management operations, and those of federal agencies tasked with the development and management of national policies, and strategic assets associated with disaster readiness. So there are huge numbers of people involved in this, but oftentimes it's not their everyday job. So you might have DPIPWE in Tasmania, for instance, which is the Department of Primary Industries, Water and Environment. Sorry, folks, it took me a while to get that out of my brain today. DPIPWE have a whole range of different people in different roles, but part of their role, so this might be their whole role, but one little slice of that role might be emergency management. And they go away to training and they learn about emergency management in order to then do that role in their everyday life. They go to special committees. They know about the action plans. They know when they're supposed to don the red helmet, run around and tell people to get the bloody hell out of the building. All of those types of things. So all of these things are involved in that process that these people are tasked with as part of their everyday job. So it might just be a very small part of their job. Of course, there's other roles, different coordinators across the state, for instance in police, who their full-time role is emergency management work. Okay. So what do emergency managers do? And I've given you a couple of videos to watch about this online because it's very, very complex and it's quite hard to find a specific write-up that says this is exactly what emergency managers do. I really like this particular definition. This is from Geoscience Australia. It's an online website which has some interesting information about emergency management. Emergency managers carry out any tasks before, during or after a disaster or emergency and contribute to creating or maintaining the safety of communities. They include police, firefighters and state emergency personnel, as well as doctors, local government employees, social workers, public health employees, land use planners and other community organisations and volunteers. So it's pretty massive. As I said before, a lot of local community organisations, non-government organisations in particular, are involved in emergency management. Red Cross, St. Vinny's, the youth organisations, they're all involved in this stuff in some way or another. The tasks of emergency management vary significantly, depending on whether or not you are discussing local, national or international issues. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail now. I just wanted to make the point that they really do vary significantly. And it depends on what level of emergency management you're involved in. If you're up here at the federal level and you're the emergency management minister, or you're involved in, so here at Emergency Management Victoria, and you're reporting to this person, the government officials about it, or alternatively, if you're doing emergency management off the side of your desk in Education Queensland or something like that, you're at this level. So the tasks of these people vary widely depending on what their role is in that process. Emergency management happens predominantly at the local level. And this is because it has a significant impact. These hazards or disasters or whatever have a significant impact on communities, the economy, infrastructure, and the environment. And all of that is managed at a local level within the states. It's very rare that you'll see federal level politicians having any direct influence on what happens on the ground. That usually happens at the level of those local people. But it can happen cross-jurisdictionally depending on what the emergency is. If there's, we saw that with September 11, where a whole bunch of different areas needed to work together in order to action what was happening in that environment. Emergency management is also talked about in two different ways. There's this language of emergency management that we have, which often is what they talk about within local community organisations and within local government. There's a focus on plans, actions, strategies, and structures being put into place to manage an emergency should that emerge. And the government responsibility is the focus here. Everyone needs to know about their roles, what those roles are, and how they need to put that into action. However, more recently, we've seen a large focus on disaster resilience. And this is, I guess, a new way of talking about emergency management, which is spreading across Australia. There's even the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. There's the National Strategy of Disaster Resilience. So this sort of national language around how we need to do emergency management is being taken up into this notion of disaster resilience. It's still very much a focus on government, but it's also a focus on local communities and individuals being resilient to disasters. So how do we educate those communities and those people so that they are best equipped to deal with different types of hazards and disasters in their local community? Individuals and communities are very much the focus of this, as opposed to the government folks, the people in Depipwe, the people in Taswater who have that emergency management knowledge and know what to put into play when something goes wrong. Resilience is about happening from the ground up. And what we saw in that community response to the floods in Brisbane is definitely an indication of resilience. The fact that the community came together by their thousands to help all of these people get the mud out of their houses so that they could then move forward with their lives. But resilience has a very specific definition. It's come into vogue in the disaster research in particular. It's an ideal sort of community level response to disasters that we see that's reminiscent of this notion of bouncing back or rebounding from a massive shock. But it's also an ecological term. A resilient ecosystem is one that can absorb a short-term shock to the system and then can, in a reasonable span of time, return to the state of the ecosystem before the shock happened. So it's kind of an ecological term, but the way that they're using it here is a little bit different to how they use it in ecological research. So what is disaster resilience there? Well, there doesn't seem to be any unanimous definition, unfortunately, and there's quite a lot of debate about what this is and what it looks like. Because, of course, you could talk about disaster resilience in me, and I'm pretty sure I have no disaster resilience at all because I've never even thought about it. You could talk about disaster resilience in people who work in the Red Cross. They would probably understand a lot more and have thought about it a lot more because they work for an organisation which often responds when there is a disaster of some sort. So the ways that they talk about disaster resilience really differs depending on what context they're applying it in. So stakeholders talk about disaster resilient communities as able to adapt, withstand, function, return to normal, and survive because they've done preparation, they are experienced in that preparation, they have social networks, and they're highly engaged in the process of disaster management and emergency management. It's seen as something that the community does rather than being an outcome as such. Disaster resilience is not an outcome, it's a process. It's a bunch of activity that people do on a day-to-day basis in order to make them more resilient to different types of hazards. Most importantly, communities are expected to adapt to changed circumstances, and depending on what those circumstances are. So, a tornado is probably a good example of this. I'm hoping it is. So when the news is, the news is sent out across the media to say that there's a tornado expected in this particular area, or there's weather conditions where tornadoes might be something that happens, everyone in the local community is informed about that. They know what to do. They have done this a lot before. They know where to stand. They know how to protect themselves. They know not to drive a car into them and all of that sort of stuff. That is disaster resilience. They literally adapt to what is going to happen in those changed circumstances. And they've practiced it, they're prepared, all of those types of things. So George and Stark talk about two key assumptions related to disaster resilience and the ways in which they approach this. Number one, communities with social capital have the ability to absorb threats more easily than those that lack trust, reciprocity, and citizenship. So if you've got a very close-knit community, you're going to be a lot more disaster resilient when it comes to time. In addition to this, citizens have the capacity to perform specific crisis management roles in ways which complement the official aspects of a crisis response. So the circumstance in Brisbane where the floodwaters receded and the community just picked up shovels, picked up their gumboots and went to town and getting all of this mud out of the way, pulling out used furniture, trying to find donations from other parts of the state. That is a fantastic example of the ways in which citizens complement official aspects of a crisis response. Okay. Whew, that's a huge amount of material that we've just covered in a very short amount of time, I think. And hopefully it demonstrates how incredibly complex this area actually is. I'm hoping it gives you a little bit more direction about the unit and how we're thinking about these concepts quite broadly in this particular unit. We are giving you the broadest of brush sweeps across an area which literally encompasses hundreds of books, thousands and thousands of different research studies in this particular area. I will send you notices every week about what we're going to do so you don't get behind and you know exactly what you need to do each week. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me at any time. And I really hope you enjoy the unit. I'm so excited about this unit because it is the first time that we're running it. So please think every week you're doing this stuff, how could it be better? What cool stuff could I send to Angie so I could make her stuff so much more awesome to interact with? Send that stuff in, give me your feedback because I'm really, really hoping to make this unit great. Anyway, that's it for now. And I'll see you hopefully in the lectorial this week. Have a great week. See you later.